So let's move on now to forgetting memories. Forgetting, by definition, is a decrease in the ability to remember a memory that you previously formed. So if you remember at the beginning, we talked about these different stages of memory, right? We had encoding, which is then stored, and then you retrieve it. Forgetting is not an issue with encoding. It's not an issue that you didn't pay enough attention to it. The key here is that in order to forget, you had to have the memory there in the first place. So, for instance, you can't just like forget someone's name immediately after you meet them because it's likely you just didn't pay enough attention and you didn't properly encode it. Another example, a lot of students will say that they forgot information they needed for the exam when in fact they were maybe daydreaming during the lecture and never actually appropriately learned the information in the first place. You can't forget something that you never learned. But forgetting might actually have some adaptive benefits. So for instance, your book shows an example that it's important to forget temporary tasks like where you parked your car. So if you never actually forgot your parking spots, imagine how much harder it would be to find your car if you can vividly remember every spot you've ever parked your car in that parking lot. Now, we can avoid this confusion and reduce the amount of work our brains have to do through forgetting. Now, the reason that you might have trouble finding your car in the parking lot still is because of a concept called interference. So interference relates to the competition between newer and older information and memory, typically when they're pretty similar. And this occurs because it takes a little while to fully consolidate and store a memory, anywhere from seconds to hours. And it might take years for memories to fully be stored permanently in the cerebral cortex. During this time, when they're being consolidated, they can be distorted or replaced with other information. So each day that you park your car in the same parking lot, you're getting interference from where you parked in the previous day. Now, this works in two directions. So a great example of this is the fact that OSU makes you change your password every 90 days. So usually, after you change your password for the first time, you're going to type in your old password quite a few times before you get used to your new password. So in this instance, the old learning, having used the old password so often, is interfering with your new learning of your new password. We call this proactive interference. Other examples include if you learn a new language, maybe your previously learned language starts to kind of peek through and you might get in the way. You might start to use words from your old language when you're trying to learn your new one. Or if a store changes location and you keep going back instinctively to their old location first. You learned their old location and that makes it harder to update. But it also could occur the opposite direction too. Retroactive interference works the opposite way. It makes that when you learn some new information, it makes it harder to remember the original thing you learned. So this would be like if you watched our lecture and then you watched a bunch of other lectures from different classes after this. So by the end of the day, you might have a hard time remembering exactly what happened in this lecture because you are getting interference with the new information. Other examples of this might be the fact that if you're taking classes with new professors in college, it might then make it harder for you to remember the names of your elementary school teachers because that's similar information and it's less relevant now. You have more names to work with. Or for instance, if you've watched a really long TV series on Netflix, you might start to forget what happened in older episodes because it's getting interfered with newer episodes. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind is that memories can be both proactive and retroactive. So maybe, for instance, when you're learning a new language, it might be harder for you to pick up the new one because you're using old language terms. But it also might then make it harder for you to remember some of the old words once you learn a new one. So it can be both retroactive and proactive. Now, There's also a process called decay, which is the reduced ability to retrieve information that you rarely use over time. Imagine trying to take last semester's final exams today. You probably wouldn't do very well, right? That's because this information in your brain has kind of reduced because you haven't used it very much. This also occurs from a lack of practice, too. For instance, I used to play tennis in high school, and I was on the court almost every day. But now, since high school, I've maybe played like twice, and I'm kind of horrible, to be honest. I kind of lost my ability to play tennis because I stopped practicing it. Now, take this apple decaying kind of as an analogy. So the apple used to be really fresh, right? And then eventually this fruit's going to kind of wither and it's going to die if it's not preserved or eaten. However, once this decayed apple dies, it then leaves behind seeds that, with a little time and effort, can then reproduce another apple, right? So it might seem like material once it's gone is gone forever, but just because you can't retrieve something now doesn't mean the memories are lost. Forgetting and decay is not a use it or lose it phenomenon necessarily. So there's a thing called method of savings, which says that it's faster to relearn information that you previously learned than information that's brand new. So for instance, maybe you took a chemistry class back in high school and at one point you had to memorize some of the elements of the periodic table. Maybe it took you, let's say, 50 practice trials, 50 flashcards in order to really understand and remember the periodic table. You might not know the elements of the periodic table now, but it might only take you 10 or 20 practice trials to reactivate and relearn it again. So in general, there's a much faster speed of learning for something you've already learned once before because you've saved some of the memories. The idea of decay is kind of similar to what we think of when we think of forgetting, but the passage of time does not do a good job of predicting what memories are going to be forgotten versus not. So think about it. I'm sure you've got memories for things that happened a long time ago that you remember super vividly, and maybe you forgot some of the details of yesterday, right? So decay doesn't fully account for all instances of forgetting. But there's also another way that forgetting can be beneficial, and that's through motivated forgetting, which is when you don't retrieve negative memories, it kind of protects you against threatening information. So motivations really influence our recall of events. We may choose to remember only the positive aspects of a memory or experience and forget or distort the negatives. So for instance, maybe before you decided to come to OSU, you may have weighed the pros and cons of deciding to attend different colleges. There may have been some pros of coming here, but also maybe some cons. However, once you made the decision and you committed to OSU, you likely were forgetting the cons that you came up with. You're more likely to remember the positive aspects of OSU and forget the cons that you had on your list. You could see, wow, this might be kind of adaptive, right? It's helpful to feel confident in why you came here. We do this motivated forgetting all the time. For instance, maybe after a bad breakup, you try to forget about your ex, or you got a bad score on an exam and you kind of block it out of your mind. Studies show that when students are given opportunities to cheat, they then conveniently demonstrated the lack of recall for ethical rules. So we're motivated to forget information and retrieve negative memories to kind of protect ourselves. So this motivated forgetting can also result in confabulation, which is confusion between real memories and imagined memories. So this is something therapists have to be cautious of a lot when they're addressing and they're working with clients. Because for instance, there can be memories that are a lot more serious. For instance, if you're a victim of child abuse or sexual abuse, you might try to repress or block out memories of that abuse. So this has a pretty adaptive, beneficial function when you're motivated to forget and block out really traumatic negative events that happened to you.